Clara Langston watched the bucket drop down the well shaft. She did not need to hear it hit bottom to know. The sound that came back up was not a splash, but a dry, wooden thud, hollow and final. The rope hung slack in her raw hands. Beside her, her father, Josiah, made a sound like dry leaves crushing. He swayed, put a hand to his chest, and then folded. He did not fall hard, but slow, collapsing onto the cracked, pale earth that had broken him. The wind, which never stopped, blew a fine layer of dust over his flannel shirt. Clara did not scream. The time for screaming had passed weeks ago, when the last of the cattle had been sold for half their worth, and the time for tears had passed a month before that, when the creek stopped running. She looked at the man on the ground, his breath coming in shallow rasps, and felt only a cold, hard stone settling in her gut. This was it, the last sign of life on their ranch, vanishing with the wind. She knelt, her knees cracking on the baked ground. "Father?" His eyes, pale blue and milky, flickered toward the empty sky. "Water," he whispered. "There is no water." She said it was not cruel, it was just the truth. She looped her arms under his, her own thin muscles straining, and dragged him back to the porch. He weighed almost nothing. He was a man made of dust and disappointment. Inside the dark, stifling cabin, her younger brother, Eli, sat in the chair his father had built for him. His legs, useless since the riding accident 2 years prior, were covered by a thin blanket despite the heat. "He fell again?" Eli's voice was sharp, brittle with an anger that had nowhere to go. "The well is dry," Clara said. She eased her father into his own chair by the cold hearth. He slumped into it, his eyes closing. "It has been dry for a month. Clara, you just did not want to see it." She ignored him, walking to the shelf where the last of their meager supplies sat. A tin of cornmeal, half a bag of beans, coffee, but no money. Nothing. The eviction notice from the bank in town was nailed by the door, a white scar against the dark wood. By first snow, winter was still 2 months off, but on the high plains, the first snow could come any time. It was a death sentence. "I am going to town," she said, pulling her mother's worn shawl from a peg. "To do what?" Eli snapped. "Beg? Steal? Or are you finally going to take Mr. Sloan up on his offer?" Clara froze, her back to him. The banker, Mr. Sloan. A man with a damp handshake and eyes that lingered too long. She had gone to him last week, asking for an extension, for any kind of mercy. He had leaned back in his leather chair, the only plush thing for 50 miles, and smiled. "Miss Langston," he'd said, steepling his fingers. "The bank is not a charity. The note is due. My father is ill. My brother, he cannot be moved." "A tragedy," Sloan had murmured, his eyes drifting down her patched calico dress. "But you are a capable woman, a resourceful woman. I see that. Perhaps a private arrangement could be made, something to offset the debt, until you are back on your feet." The meaning was as clear as spring water, and just as cold. She had felt a hot, filthy shame rise in her throat. "I will find another way," she had said, her voice shaking. "There is no other way." He'd called after her. Now, facing her brother, she pulled the shawl tighter. "I will not degrade myself." "Selling the ranch is degrading. Letting father die is degrading." "He is not dying," she lied. "He is," Eli whispered, all the fight gone out of him, leaving just a hollow, aching boy. "And so are we." Clara walked out, saddling their last horse, a bony mare named Dust. She rode toward town, but her hands pulled the reins in another direction. Not toward the bank, not toward the false comfort of the church. She was riding north, toward the foothills, toward the last, desperate, and most dangerous idea she had ever had. She remembered the cowboy. He had shown up a year ago, taking work on the Miller Ranch, the one that still had water. He kept to himself. The other hands called him cold, distant. Some said he was dangerous, that he had a past. His name was Colt McCrae. She had seen him only twice. The first time, in town. He had been standing outside the saloon, watching the street. His stillness was what caught her. He was not relaxed. Like the other men loafing on the boardwalk, he was still like a predator, coiled and watchful. He had scars on his hands, and a faint white line that ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent, grim set. The second time, her wagon had thrown a wheel in a dry wash 6 miles from home. It was nearing dusk. She had been struggling with the heavy spoke, near tears of frustration, when he had simply appeared, riding out of the shadows. He had not spoken. He dismounted, and with a grunt, lifted the wagon bed himself, his shoulders straining against his shirt. He reset the wheel, hammered it tight with a rock, and was back on his horse before she could properly thank him. "Wait," she had called out. He had paused, his horse dancing. He looked at her, and his eyes, they were the color of a winter sky, empty and cold. He'd given a curt nod, and was gone. He was a man who did not speak, who did not smile, a man surrounded by quiet, by scars, and by ghosts. He was the only man she knew who looked strong enough to fight the land, and mean enough to win. She found him repairing a fence line deep in the foothills, miles from any other living soul. The wind was high here, whistling through the pines. He worked without a coat, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing thick, roped forearms. The fencing wire sang as he stretched it taut, the muscles in his back rippling with the effort. He did not look up as she approached, though he must have heard her. He finished setting the staple, hammering it in with 2 precise, brutal strokes. Only then did he turn. He stood, his hand resting on the hammer. He was taller than she remembered. The wind pushed his dark hair back from his face. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed, waiting. Clara's throat was dry. The words she had practiced seemed foolish now, romantic. She fell back on the only thing she had left, the truth. "Mr. McCrae," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have a proposal for you." He just watched her. "My father is dying. My ranch. The bank is taking it. I have a brother who is disabled. We will not survive the winter." His expression did not change. He was not moved. He was a stone. "I have land." She pushed on, her voice rising. 1,000 acres. The well is dry, but the creek bed just needs to be dammed. The house is solid. It needs work, but it is solid. "Get to the point, Miss Langston." His voice was low, rough, like gravel shifting. Clara took a breath. "I need a husband, someone to work the land, someone whose name on a deed will stop the bank." She looked him square in the face. "I am proposing marriage, not for love, for duty, my land, my name, for your strength. A bargain." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the pines. Then, Colt McCrae threw back his head and laughed. It was not a sound of humor. It was a short, harsh, barking sound that held no warmth at all. "Marriage," he said, as if the word tasted bad. "You ride all the way out here to ask me to marry you." "I am not asking. I am proposing a contract." "I do not marry," he said, turning back to his fence. "I do not trust, and I do not need 1,000 acres of dust." Clara felt the cold stone in her gut crack. This was it, the end. She should have turned the horse. She should have ridden away. But she thought of Eli's thin legs, of her father's rattling breath. "I saw you in town," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying. "I see how the other men look at you. They fear you. I see how you watch the road, like you are waiting for someone. You are a man who needs a place to disappear. My ranch, it is remote. No one comes up there. You could be a ghost there. You give me your name and your back, and I will give you my land and my silence. No one will ever look for you there." He stopped working. His back was to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. He stood that way for a full minute. When he turned, the laugh was gone. His eyes were flat, assessing her like she was a piece of livestock he was considering buying. "You are desperate," he stated. "I am," she agreed. "You would tie yourself to a man you do not know, a man they say is dangerous. Danger from one man is better than the danger of winter. Mr. McCrae, I have no choice left." He studied her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. He saw the chapped skin on her hands, the hollows under her cheekbones, and the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. It was not courage he saw. It was the simple absence of anything left to lose. That, perhaps, he understood. "I agree," he said, his voice flat. "But there are conditions." Clara waited. "We are married on paper. I will work the land. I will stop the bank. I will keep you and the boy sheltered and fed. But that is all." He took a step closer, and she had to fight the urge to make dust back away. "The house is yours. The barn, the fields, they are mine. There will be no affection. There will be no expectations. It is a contract, a shelter, nothing more. Do you understand me?" "Yes," she said. "You will not come to my bed. You will not ask me about my past. You will not speak of me in town." "I understand," Clara said, her throat tight. "And I will not be your friend," he added, as a final, sharp blow. "I am not looking for a friend. Mr. McCrae, I am looking for a shield." He stared at her for another long moment, then nodded once. He walked past her, picked up his hammer, and slid it into the loop on his saddle. "I will follow you back. We will tell the preacher." Clara wanted to weep with relief, or maybe with terror. She could not tell the difference. Instead, she just nodded. She held out her hand. "It is a bargain, then?" He looked at her small, chapped hand, then at his own, which was scarred and stained with dirt. He hesitated, then wiped his palm on his jeans before taking hers. His grip was not a handshake. It was a cage. It was impossibly strong and cold, even in the afternoon sun. "A bargain," he agreed, and dropped her hand as if it burned. They rode back to the ranch, Colt 10 paces behind her, a silent, dark shadow. Word spread through a town like theirs the way a sickness does, fast, invisible, and leaving everyone feeling vaguely unclean. Clara went to the preacher, a stern man named Gideon, and told him. Colt went to the saloon, not to drink, but to buy a new axe head and 300 pounds of flour and beans, paying with a worn leather poke that silenced the storekeep's questions. By the time Clara was back at the cabin, the whispers had already begun. Clara Langston, desperate, buying herself a husband, and that one, that Colt McCrae, half wild, they say. What kind of man agrees to that? She found Eli in his chair, his face pale with fury. "You did not," he hissed. "It is done, Eli. He will work the land. We are safe." "Safe? You married a savage, a man who said yes," Clara shouted, her control finally snapping. "A man who will put a roof over your head and food in your mouth, which is more than I can do. It is done. You will be civil." "I will not," Eli whispered. "I will never." A shadow fell across the doorway. Colt McCrae stood there, filling the frame. He had the axe head in one hand. He looked at Eli in his chair, then at Clara, his face impossible to read. The cabin, which had always felt too small, suddenly felt suffocating. "Where is your father?" Colt asked. Clara turned. Her father was still in the chair by the hearth. He had not moved. She walked over, a new dread climbing her throat. She touched his shoulder. He was cold. His head lolled back, his eyes half open, staring at nothing. He had slipped away while she was out, quiet as a shadow. "He is gone," she said, her voice numb. Eli let out a broken sob. Clara stood there, swaying. The man she had done this for, the man she had sold herself for, was gone. The bargain was already spoiled. Colt looked at the dead man, then at Clara's white, shocked face, then at the weeping boy. He did not say a word of comfort. He did not touch her. He walked past them, out the door, and came back a minute later with a shovel. "Show me where," he said. They buried him the next morning on the hill overlooking the dry creek. Colt dug the grave. The ground was like iron, but he did not slow, his movements rhythmic and powerful. He lowered Josiah Langston into the earth himself. Clara said a few words from the Bible, her voice breaking on the green pastures. Eli watched from the porch, his face a mask of grief and hatred. When it was over, Colt filled the grave, tamping the earth down with the back of the shovel. He left the shovel leaning against the fresh mound of dirt and walked away, toward the barn, without a single backward glance. They were married 2 days later. The church was empty, save for Preacher Gideon, who looked at them both with profound disapproval, and 2 old prospectors Colt had paid a dime apiece to witness. The church smelled of dust, old wood, and judgment. Clara wore her mother's Sunday dress, a faded blue cotton that hung loose on her frame. She had not bothered with a veil. Colt stood beside her, wearing the same clothes he always wore. Though they were clean, he had shaved. The scar on his jaw looked raw and new. He stood stiffly, his eyes fixed on the stained glass window behind the preacher, as if he were expecting an attack. The vows were stripped to their barest bones. "Do you, Clara Langston, take this man?" Clara looked at the dust motes dancing in the beam of light. "I do." "Do you, Colt McCrae, take this woman?" He was silent for a long moment. "I do," he said, his voice a low rumble that sounded like a threat. I pronounce you man and wife," the preacher stammered, clearly wanting it to be over. There was no kiss, there was no rice. There was just the scraping of the pen as they signed the register. Clara's hand was shaking. Colt's was perfectly steady. They walked out into the harsh, bright sunlight, husband and wife. A few townsfolk watched from across the street, their faces a mixture of pity and scorn. Clara kept her chin high and walked to the wagon. Colt lifted her up by the elbow, his touch brief and impersonal, and climbed up beside her. The ride back to the ranch was silent. That night, the cabin was a tomb. Eli had barricaded himself in his small room, refusing supper. Clara had cooked a pot of beans, but the smell of it just made her stomach turn. Colt sat at the table, checking the action on his rifle. He disassembled it and cleaned it with an oiled rag. His movements economical and precise. He seemed completely unaware of her. Clara paced the small room, her hands twisting in her dress. This was her wedding night. She was a wife, but she felt more alone than she ever had in her life. The silence stretched, filled only by the click of metal on wood as Colt worked. Finally, she could not bear it. She retreated to her own room, the one she had once shared with her mother, and closed the door. She did not lock it. That had not been part of the bargain. But she leaned against it, her heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm. She sat on the edge of her bed, in her faded dress, and listened to the sounds of her husband in the next room. The cabin was small. She could hear him stand, hear his boots cross the floor. She heard the scrape of a chair. He was not coming to her. He was keeping his word. She should have been relieved. Instead, a desolate, aching loneliness settled over her, heavier than any grief she had yet known. She finally lay down, still fully clothed, and pulled her mother's quilt over her. She turned her face to the wall, and the tears she had refused to shed at the well, at the bank, and at the grave, finally came. They were hot and silent, soaking the pillow beneath her cheek. She cried for her father, for her brother, for the land, and for the cold. empty bargain she had made just to survive. In the main room, Colt McCrae did not go to bed. He sat in the chair by the front window, the one that faced the road. He pulled his knife from the sheath on his belt. By the pale light of the moon, he pulled a whetstone from his pocket. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was quiet, rhythmic, and sharp. It cut through the silence of the house, a barrier of steel and vigilance. He sat there for hours, sharpening the blade, his eyes on the darkness outside, a guardian who would not sleep and a husband who would not touch. Colt did not move into the house. He kept his word to the letter. He took the barn. He swept out an empty stall that was cleaner than the cabin, threw his bedroll in the corner, and stacked his few possessions, a spare shirt, a whetstone, a box of cartridges, on a plank of wood. The house was hers. He had said, the barn, the fields, they were his. The ranch was a graveyard. It was worse than Clara had let on, and worse than he had guessed. The land was not just resting, it was broken. The fences were scattered heaps of split rails. The barn roof had holes a man could fall through, and the porch of the main house sagged like a tired old woman. Colt set to work. He was a silent storm. He rose before the first hint of light, his movements shadow and noise in the pre-dawn cold. He did not start with the fences or the house. He started with the land itself. He walked the property for 2 days, his head down, kicking at the dirt, tasting the wind. He found an old well site, one Josiah Langston had abandoned years ago, a mile from the house. He spent the next 3 days down in that hole. Clara would see the bucket rising and falling, hoisted by a rope and pulley he had rigged to the saddle horn of his horse. He dug through hardpan and rock, widening the shaft, reinforcing it with stones. On the 3rd evening, he came back to the barn covered in a thick, gray mud. The next morning, Clara saw him drawing water. It was not much, just a slow, muddy seep, but it was water. It was life. He moved on. He worked with a cold, contained fury, as if he hated the very ground he was mending. He tore down the old fences and began setting new posts, his axe and hammer blows echoing across the valley from sunup to sundown. He did not ask for help. He did not speak. He just worked. While Colt waged his war outside, Clara fought her own inside. Eli had fallen into a black, bitter resentment. He sat in his chair, his hands clenched on the useless arms, his eyes fixed on the man working in the yard. "He is just a hired hand, Clara," Eli sneered, his voice thin. "A hired hand you paid for with our name." Clara stopped her mending, the needle poised over a patch on Eli's worn trousers. "He is my husband. He is keeping us fed." "He does not even look at you," Eli shot back. "He eats in the barn. The whole town knows. They are laughing at you, at us." "Let them laugh," Clara said, her voice low. "Let them laugh while we eat his food and drink his water. I will not hear another word against him. Eli, he is the only reason Mr. Sloan has not thrown us onto the road. Father would be ashamed." "Father is dead," Clara whispered, the words sharp and cruel. "Father left us with nothing but dust and debt. I did what I had to do to keep you alive. You can hate me for it, but you will be civil." Eli turned his chair away from her, his shoulders shaking. "I wish he had just let us die." The supplies Colt had bought in town began to dwindle. The sack of flour was half empty. The coffee tin light. Clara knew she could not ask Colt for money. That was not the bargain. The household was her domain. She harnessed their bony mare to the wagon, the wheels strong and true from where Colt had repaired them. She rode into town, a list clutched in her hand, her stomach a cold knot of dread. The town was quiet, too quiet. As she tied the mare to the hitching post outside the general store, she felt the eyes. Mrs. Gideon, the preacher's wife, was walking toward the store, saw Clara, and abruptly crossed the dusty street, her head held high. On the saloon porch, the usual loafers stopped talking. They just watched her. The whispers of her desperate marriage had settled over her name like a shroud. She pushed open the store door, the little bell above it jangling a false welcome. Mr. Henderson, the clerk, was behind the counter, polishing a glass jar. Mrs. McCrae, he said. The new name felt like an insult in his mouth. Mr. Henderson, Clara said, keeping her chin high. I need 20 pounds of flour, salt, and a tin of kerosene, and a small bag of beans. Henderson gathered the items, his movements slow. He lined them up on the counter, a barrier between them. That will be $2.60. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks. I need you to put it on our account, Mr. Henderson, just until... The Langston account is closed. Clara, he said, his voice losing its polite edge. He stopped polishing the jar. Your father's debt. I cannot... This is not the Langston account, she said, her voice shaking slightly. This is the McCrae account. Henderson permitted himself a small, thin smile. I do not know Mr. McCrae. I cannot extend credit on the name of a drifter, no matter who he has, convinced to marry him. Cash only. I am afraid. His voice was loud enough for the two women browsing calico in the back to hear. They stopped their chatter. Clara stood there, trapped in the silence, her shame so thick she could barely breathe. Please, she whispered. My brother is ill. We just need... Cash only. How much? The voice was low, and it came from directly behind her. Clara spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Colt stood there. He had not made a sound. He filled the doorway, blocking the light, his shadow falling across the counter. He looked at Henderson, his eyes flat and cold as river stones. $2.60, Henderson stammered, his confidence evaporating. Colt moved past Clara. He did not look at her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out $3 silver. He did not place them on the counter. He slapped them down, one by one. The thwack of the metal on the wood was like a judge's gavel. And a box of cartridges, Colt said, his voice a low rumble. 44s. Henderson fumbled under the counter, producing the ammunition. Colt looked at Clara. His expression did not soften. Anything else? She was too stunned to speak. She just shook her head. He picked up the 20-pound sack of flour with one hand as if it were a pillow, tucked the kerosene can under his other arm, and motioned for her to take the smaller items. He did not wait for his change. He turned and walked out. Clara, clutching the salt and beans, hurried after him. The men on the saloon porch were no longer watching her with scorn. They were watching Colt with a new, wary respect. He loaded the supplies into the wagon, his movements swift and economical. You did not have to, Clara said, her voice quiet. They will not deny you again, he said. It was not a promise. It was a statement of fact. He did not get in the wagon. He untied his own horse from the rail. Go on home. I have to see the blacksmith about a plowshare. She watched him ride down the street, his back straight. A solitary, unbending man. The town was taking notice. They saw a man who paid in silver, who bought bullets, and who did not give a damn for their whispers. The incident did not thaw the ice between them. It may have frozen it harder. He had kept his bargain. A shelter, he had called it. But he had also reinforced the wall. Clara cooked. It was the only thing she knew to do, the only part of the bargain she could keep. She made stews from the jackrabbits Colt shot and left hanging on the porch. She baked heavy, dark bread. She and Eli would eat at the small table, the silence broken only by the scrape of spoon against bowl. She would leave a plate for Colt on the cold stove, covered with a cloth. Hours later, she would be in her bed, listening. The cabin door would creak open. She would hear his heavy boots cross the floor, the sound of the water dipper, the scrape of the plate as he took it. Then the door would close. He ate his food cold, alone, in the dark of the barn. They lived like ghosts in the small cabin, orbiting each other but never touching. If he came in to fill the water buckets, she would find a sudden, urgent need to sweep the porch. If she was at the stove, he would stand in the doorway, waiting, his silence a heavy weight, until she moved. They passed in the yard, sometimes only inches apart, and never once did their eyes meet. The tension was a living thing, a third person in their marriage. The first hard rain of the season came in the night, a cold, driving storm that turned the world to mud. The wind howled, and the roof, despite Colt's patches, began to weep. Eli was restless, the damp air making his dead legs ache with phantom pains. "It is leaking!" he yelled, pointing from his chair. A dark, steady drip was striking the floorboards. "I will get a bucket," Clara said, her voice worn thin. "This whole place is going to flood. He said he fixed it. He lied. He fixes nothing." Eli's voice cracked with a near-hysterical panic. He grabbed the wheels of his chair, trying to push himself away from the drip, his movements jerky and weak. The chair leg caught on a warped floorboard. He pushed harder, his face pale with sweat and fury. The chair overbalanced, tipping sideways. Eli flailed, his arms grasping at the air, and went down hard. His head struck the stone edge of the cold hearth with a sickening crack. He did not yell. All the air left his body in a choked gasp. "Eli!" Clara screamed, scrambling, trying to get her arms under his shoulders. He was a dead weight, his eyes wide and unseeing. The cabin door burst open, slamming against the interior wall so hard the tin lantern rattled. Colt stood there, rain and wind whipping in behind him, his shirt plastered to his skin. He took in the scene in one dark, assessing glance. Clara, crying. Eli motionless on the floor. "Get back," he commanded. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He did not try to lift Eli carefully. He bent, looped his arms under Eli's back and knees, and lifted him in one explosive, powerful grunt. The effort was immense. As Colt straightened, his wet shirt pulled taut across his back like a second skin. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Through the soaked, thin cotton, she saw it, in the dim lantern light. His entire back was a ruined map of puckered, ropey tissue. It was not the neat, crisscrossed pattern of a whip. It was a burn. An ancient, massive burn that had melted the skin, covering his left shoulder blade and running in a horrific sweep down to his waist. Colt, seemingly unaware, carried Eli to the bed and laid him down, his motions suddenly gentle. "He hit his head," Clara whispered, her eyes rooted to Colt's back. Colt turned. He saw her face. He saw where she was looking, his expression, already grim, closed like a steel trap. He grabbed the dry quilt from the foot of Eli's bed and, in a single, angry motion, slung it over his own shoulders, hiding himself. He stared at her for one hard second, his eyes daring her to speak. Then he turned and walked back out into the storm, pulling the door shut behind him with a quiet, final click. Eli had a deep gash on his temple, but he was breathing, his pulse steady. Clara cleaned the wound, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the cloth. She was not shaking for Eli. She was shaking from what she had seen, a wound that spoke of an agony she could not comprehend, a fire. She sat by Eli's bed until his breathing evened out and he fell into a troubled sleep. The storm raged outside, but all she could think of was Colt, in the barn, soaked to the bone, with those scars. It was not affection. It was not breaking the bargain. It was decency. She grabbed her heaviest shawl, lit the other lantern, and ran through the driving rain to the barn. The mud sucked at her boots. She found him in his stall, rubbing down his horse with a dry sack. He was shirtless. His back was to her. In the swaying lantern light, the scars were worse than she had imagined. They were deep, waxy, and old. So old. He must have heard her, or perhaps he sensed her. He spun around, his eyes flashing with a wild, cornered panic. He grabbed his wet shirt from a peg and yanked it on, wincing as the cold, damp fabric touched the ruined skin. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Clara held the lantern up, her hand trembling. "I came to thank you for Eli. He is sleeping. He needed moving. I moved him." He turned his back on her, grabbing a brush, his movements sharp, angry. "You're back," she whispered, unable to help herself. "You are hurt. The rain. It must make it." "It is none of your business." He cut her off. "I told you, no questions, no expectations." "I am not asking, I am thanking you. You are soaked, you will be sick." "I do not get sick," he said, "and I do not need your thanks." He kept his back to her. "Go back to the house. Clara, the contract does not include you worrying over me." She stood there, rainwater dripping from her shawl, feeling utterly dismissed. He had built a wall of scars and silence, and she had just bounced off it. She turned and fled, back into the cold mud. The image of his back burned into her mind. A week later, the storm had passed. Mr. Agnew, their closest neighbor 5 miles down the canyon, rode over. He was a leathery old man with kind eyes, and he had come to see the new well. "He did fine work," Agnew said, spitting a stream of tobacco. "Knew he would. That one's a worker." "You know him?" Clara asked, offering him a dipper of the new, clean water. "Knew of him." Agnew drank, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. "He worked for the Miller outfit before he came here. Miller said he worked like 2 men, but I knew his people, back in Texas. Long time ago." A cold stillness settled over Clara. "His people?" "The McCraes, a hard-cussed bunch. The father, old Jed, was a mean one. Colt was the oldest, had a younger brother, Wyatt, I think, real little." Agnew shook his head, looking at the horizon. "Tragic." What happened?" "Fire." Agnew said simply. "Barn fire. Kids were in the loft. Folks said they were playing with matches. The father, he blamed Colt, said he was supposed to be watching the little one." Clara felt the dipper slip in her hand. Fire, scars. "Did the brother—" "Wyatt died," Agnew said, his voice flat. "Burned up. They said Colt nearly died right with him. Went straight into the inferno, came back out carrying the boy, both of them smoking. But the little one was already gone. They said Colt's back was, it was bad. He rode out about a month later. Cannot say I blame him. Some things you just cannot outlive, especially when your own kin is pointing the finger." Agnew handed her back the dipper. "You tell your husband it is good water, good, sweet water." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. That night, Colt sat in the barn, the whetstone in his hand, but he was not sharpening his knife. He was seeing the flames. Agnew's visit had kicked the embers. He was 17. The smoke was thick, acrid. It was not just hay. It was the smell of burning pitch and something else, something worse. He heard the screaming. It was high, terrified. "Wyatt!" "Colt, help me! It hurts! Colt!" He had scrambled up the loft ladder, the rungs already blistering his hands. He found him in the corner, flames licking at the legs of his overalls. "I got you! Wyatt, I got you!" He had grabbed him, thrown him over his shoulder. Wyatt was screaming, beating on his back, and then the main beam, heavy and burning, gave way. It fell, striking Colt across the back, driving him and his brother down into the roaring haymow below. He had woken up on the wet grass, the barn a column of fire against the black sky. His father was standing over him, and he was still holding Wyatt, a small, silent, charred thing. "You killed him," his father had whispered, his voice shaking with a terrible, cold rage. "You were supposed to watch him. You let him burn. Colt had looked at the ruin in his arms, and then at the ruin of the barn, and felt the fire on his back. He had not made a sound. The guilt had burned hotter, deeper, than any flame. The weather turned warm again, a false Indian summer. Colt was in the south pasture, clearing stumps. It was brutal, punishing work, fighting land that had been left to die. Clara watched him from the porch. He was shirtless. The sun beat down on his back, illuminating the stark white of the scars against the bronze of his healthy skin. He swung the pickaxe, his entire body coiling and uncoiling, a picture of relentless, terrible strength. She felt a pull she did not understand. It was not pity, it was recognition. She saw the guilt. She saw the fire he was still trying to outrun, the pain he was trying to bury with work. She filled a tin dipper from the new well, the water blessedly cold. She walked out across the broken field. He heard her coming and stopped, resting the pickaxe on his shoulder. He was breathing hard, sweat carving clean rivers through the dust on his chest. He watched her approach, his eyes narrowed, wary. She did not say a word. She just held out the dipper of water. He stared at it, then at her face. He saw no pity there, just an offer. Slowly, he reached out and took it. His calloused, dirt-caked fingers brushed hers. It was nothing, a touch as light as a moth's wing, but it shot through Clara like a jolt of lightning. It was the first time they had touched, skin to skin, since the cold, hard grip of their bargain. His hand was rough, but it was warm. He drank the water in 3 long, deep swallows, his throat working. He handed the dipper back, and their fingers brushed again. "Supper," she managed to say, her voice thick. "It will be ready soon." He just nodded, his eyes on the dipper in her hand. He turned, hefted the pickaxe, and swung it, the blade biting deep into the stubborn wood. Clara walked back to the house, the skin on her hand tingling. That night, she dreamed. She was not in the cold, dark cabin. She was lying in a field of tall, golden grass. The sun was on her face, but it was not the harsh sun of the plains. It was a gentle, loving warmth. She was not alone. Colt was lying beside her, on his back, his eyes closed, his face at peace. The scars were gone. This was not the grim, silent man from the barn. This was just a man, resting. In the dream, she felt no fear. She rolled onto her side, close to him, close enough to feel the heat from his skin. She felt a profound, aching sense of safety, a feeling she had forgotten existed. She laid her head on his shoulder. He did not move, but she felt his hand come up to cover hers, warm, strong. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding. The cabin was pitch black and cold. The dream was so real. She could still feel the weight of his hand. She was in her narrow bed, alone. She heard a sound from the main room, a boot scraping the floor, a quiet click. He was awake, sitting by the window. She knew his routine. He was sitting in the dark, watching the road. The memory of the dream, the feeling of safety washed over her, followed immediately by a wave of sharp, cold panic. What was she doing? He was a stranger, a man who had warned her. No affection, no expectations. She was dreaming of him. She was feeling safe with him. She was a fool. Clara slipped from her bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. She crept to her door. She listened. Only silence from the other room. Her hand was shaking. She reached for the small iron bolt she had never used. With a quiet, heavy snick, she slid the bolt into its housing. She leaned her forehead against the rough wood, her eyes squeezed shut. She had locked her door, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, he would never have tried to open it. She had not locked him out. She had locked herself in. The sky broke. It did not just rain. It was as if the prairie was trying to drown itself. The wind came first, A high, thin scream, followed by a sheet of gray water that hit the cabin like a solid wall. Eli, in his chair by the hearth, jumped as a new leak. A violent cascade burst from the ceiling, splashing onto the floor near his feet. "Clara, it is coming in! The roof is gone!" Clara grabbed the cooking pot, sliding it under the torrent. It was not a drip, it was a tear. The wind shrieked, and a sound like a giant's hand ripping canvas came from above. A section of the roof, the part Colt had not yet reached, was peeling back. The door flew open, and Colt was there, his face grim, soaked to the bone in the second it took him to cross the threshold. "Get your brother to the center of the room," he yelled over the roar of the storm. "Now!" He grabbed his hammer and a sack of nails from his box by the door, and was gone. Climbing the rickety ladder to the loft, Clara pushed Eli's chair, the wheels sticking in the mud that was already forming on the floor. "He cannot fix it. We are going to drown in here," Eli cried, his hands covering his head. "Be quiet, Eli! He is trying!" Clara looked up. Through the hole in the roof, she could see the dark, churning sky. She saw Colt's silhouette move above it, out on the roof, in the heart of the storm. She heard the frantic, desperate sound of his hammer. She grabbed her heaviest shawl and ran outside. The world was water and noise. The wind nearly knocked her from her feet. She saw him, braced against the chimney, trying to hold down a loose sheet of tin with one hand while hammering with the other. "Colt!" she screamed. He did not hear her. The wind ripped the tin from his grasp, sending it spinning into the darkness. He roared in frustration, a sound swallowed by the thunder. Clara scrambled up the side of the woodpile and onto the slick, treacherous porch roof, then hauled herself onto the main roof, her skirt heavy with water. Tried to drag her back down. She crawled to him on her hands and knees. "Colt!" He spun, his eyes wide with disbelief. Seeing her, "Get down! Are you insane?" "You cannot do it alone!" she screamed back, her hair plastered to her face. He stared at her for 1 second, the rain streaming off his face. He did not argue. He did not have time. He pointed to a loose plank. "Hold it! Hold it flat!" For an hour, they fought the sky. They worked side by side, wordless, soaked to the skin. Two small figures against a universe of rage. He hammered. She held. She passed him nails, her small, cold fingers brushing his. He would brace his feet, giving her leverage to pull a board tight. The rain was so cold it felt like needles, and the wind threatened to peel them both from their perch. At some point, a jagged line of lightning split the sky, illuminating them. They were both crouched low, breathing hard, looking at each other. They were not husband and wife. They were not stranger and burden. They were just two people, soaked, cold, and fighting the same relentless enemy. Something shifted. The wall of silence that had lived between them did not break, but it had been breached. When the last board was secured, and the worst of the leak was reduced to a manageable drip, he grabbed her arm. "Go, now!" He did not let her climb down alone. He went first, backward, his boots finding the holds, his hand locked on her wrist, guiding her feet, lowering her into the relative safety of the porch. They stood there, dripping, gasping for air. "Thank you," she said, her teeth chattering. He just nodded, his chest heaving, and went to the barn. That night, the cabin was a damp, cold cave, but the roof held. Clara cooked a thick stew, the smell of salt pork and beans filling the small room. She felt an exhaustion so deep it was almost peace. She set 3 bowls on the table, one for Eli, who was bundled in every blanket they owned, one for herself, and one at the head of the table. She did not call for Colt. She did not leave a plate on the stove. She just set the bowl. She and Eli began to eat. The cabin door opened. Colt stood there, water dripping from his hat. He was clean. He must have used the rainwater barrel to wash. He looked at the bowl. He looked at Clara. She met his gaze, then looked back down at her own food, her heart pounding. For a long minute, he did not move. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he took off his hat and hung it on the peg. He walked to the table and sat down. The sound of his chair scraping the floor was deafening. They ate. The silence was absolute, broken only by the click of their spoons against the tin bowls. Eli, for once, said nothing. He just watched them both, his eyes wide. Colt ate quickly, his gaze fixed on the stew. He did not look up, but he was there. He had not taken his food to the barn. When he was finished, he stood, put his bowl in the wash basin, and nodded once to Clara. "Ma'am," he said, and left. Clara let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. The small breach became a path. A few days later, Eli was sitting on the porch, his face set in its usual mask of sullen boredom. He was trying to carve a piece of wood with his father's old pocket knife, but the blade was dull, and he was just tearing the grain. Colt, mending a piece of tack, watched him from the barn doorway. He observed for several minutes, his face unreadable. Then he walked over. Eli flinched, tucking the knife away as if expecting a rebuke. Colt just held out his hand. "Give it here." Eli hesitated. "It is mine." "It is dull," Colt replied, his voice flat. "A dull knife is more dangerous than a sharp one. It makes you force it. That is how you lose a thumb." Reluctantly, Eli handed it over. Colt sat on the porch step, bracing his back against the post. He pulled his whetstone from his pocket. The familiar, rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape filled the quiet afternoon. He did not just sharpen it, he showed Eli. "You feel that?" he said, guiding Eli's finger over the edge. "That is the burr. You work one side until you raise it, then you work the other to take it off. Keep the angle steady. Let the stone do the work." His voice was low, patient. He spoke about the steel, how to read its temper, how to listen to the sound it made on the stone. Eli, fascinated despite himself, leaned forward, his anger forgotten. Colt finished, tested the blade on his thumb, and handed the knife and the stone to Eli. "You keep it. A man needs to keep his tools sharp." Eli looked at the stone, then at Colt. "Thank you," he mumbled. So low Clara, watching from the window, barely heard it. Colt just nodded and went back to his tack. Eli looked down at the knife and, for the first time in months, began to whittle, his movements careful and focused. Clara began to smile again. It was a small, quiet thing, but it was there. She found a strange, hard comfort in the new routine. The ranch was no longer a place of death. It was a place of work. Colt's steady presence was as reliable as the sunrise. The fences were straight. The new well was deep. The small patch of earth he had plowed was already green with winter wheat. Their meals became a fixture. They remained silent, but it was no longer a hostile silence. It was the shared, weary silence of two people who had worked too hard to have energy for words. It was the silence of shared purpose. One morning, the air was crisp with the first real hint of autumn. Clara stood by the small, cracked mirror that hung by the door, brushing out her hair. It was long and thick, chestnut brown, her one vanity from a life that felt a lifetime ago. She gathered it, her arms raised, and began to braid it for the day. She caught his reflection in the glass. He was standing in the open doorway, his morning coffee cup halfway to his lips. He was just watching her. His face was unguarded. It was not the look of a man looking at a wife. It was the look of a man starving, seeing a table set for someone else. It was a profound, quiet longing for something simple and beautiful, something he clearly believed he had no right to. Her fingers faltered on the braid. He saw her eyes meet his in the mirror. A dark flush rose up his neck. He looked down at his cup as if he had forgotten it was there. He turned abruptly and walked out, his coffee unfinished. shame radiating from his stiff back. Clara was left with her heart pounding, the braid half finished in her hands. That Saturday, the town held its annual harvest festival. It was a small, dusty affair, but it was the one time in the year the scattered, isolated families of the county came together. Clara, who had not spoken to another woman in months, felt a desperate pull to go. She asked him at supper. "Colt," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "The festival is on Saturday. I would like to go." Eli scoffed from his corner. "Go on, then. Show off your prize. Let them all stare." Colt did not look up from his plate. He chewed, swallowed, and set his fork down. "Why?" "Because I am tired of hiding," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I am tired of being ashamed. We are married. You are my husband. I am your wife. We will go, and we will buy the supplies we need, and we will not look away from them." He looked at her then. He saw the steel in her spine. It was the same steel that had made her ride out to find him. He gave one short, reluctant nod. Saturday. When they rode the wagon into town, it was as if they had stopped the world. The music from a lone fiddle wavered and died. Conversation stopped. Every eye turned to them. To Clara, sitting straight in her blue Sunday dress. To Colt, a solid, unmoving wall beside her. And to Eli, his face pale, sitting in the wagon bed. The whispers started, a sound like dry leaves skittering over the hard pan. "Look, it is them." He actually brought her the nerve. Shameless, the both of them. Clara kept her chin high, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap, her nails dug into her palms. Colt got down and came around the wagon. He did not offer her his hand. He put his hands on her waist and lifted her down, his touch impersonal, but possessive. He walked beside her, his hand not touching her, but hovering near the small of her back. It was not a gesture of affection. It was a warning, a shield. They walked toward the mercantile, and Jeb Stewart blocked their path. Jeb was a man who had lost his own ranch to drought and the bottle, and he carried his bitterness like a loaded gun. Well, he slurred, his eyes sliding over Clara. "Mrs. McCrae, or is it still Miss Langston? Heard you found a creative way to pay your debts." Clara tried to step around him. "Excuse us, Mr. Stewart." Colt's hand settled on her arm, stopping her. "Move, Jeb," he said, his voice low. "Or what, McCrae?" Jeb grinned, emboldened by the whiskey and his audience. "You gonna burn my barn down, too? I heard about you, firebug, killer." Colt went perfectly still. The air around him turned ice cold. Jeb, mistaking the stillness for fear, turned his mean, bleary eyes back to Clara. "How much, Clara? How much for a man like that to look the other way? Or did you just offer him the same thing you offered that banker, Sloan?" Clara flinched, a small, wounded sound escaping her. It happened faster than a breath. Colt's hand was gone from her arm. His fist moved in a short, brutal, economical arc. It was not a barroom swing. It was a blow meant to end a fight. It connected with Jeb's jaw with a sickening, wet crack. Jeb Stewart was lifted from his feet. He flew backward and landed flat in the horse trough, a plume of muddy water and slime exploding into the air. He did not move. The town was dead silent. Even the fiddle player was frozen. Colt did not look at the man he had hit. He just flexed his fist, shaking the pain from his knuckles. He turned to Clara, his face a mask of cold, contained fury. "We are leaving." The ride home was a silent, vibrating agony. Eli had not said a word. His face white. Clara stared at the road, her hands shaking. Colt drove the wagon, his split, bleeding knuckles white on the reins. That night, Eli went to his room, slamming the door. Clara could not be inside. The cabin felt too small. too full of what had happened. She went out to the field behind the barn, where the tall, dry grass met the new fence line, the moonlight silvering the world. He was there, leaning on the top rail, staring out at the dark hills. He was just a shadow, but she could feel the anger rolling off him. She stood near him, not touching, the air between them crackling. "You did not have to do that," she whispered. "He is just a drunk. His words, they are just wind." Colt turned his head. His face was all shadow, but she could see the hard glitter of his eyes. The anger was still there. But beneath it, she saw what he had shown her in the mirror. A terrible, raw longing, and a deep, profound regret. Regret for hitting the man. Regret for being the kind of man who had to. Regret for dragging her name further into the mud. "He had no right," Colt said, his voice rough. "He had no right to speak to you that way." "No," Clara said softly. "He did not." She took a step closer. Her heart was a drum against her ribs. This was not the bargain. This was the man who sat at her table, the man who taught her brother, the man who had just defended her name. She reached up, her hand trembling, and gently touched his split, bleeding knuckles. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but he did not pull away. "You are bleeding," she whispered. She lifted her hand, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw, the one that pulled his mouth into a grim line. He closed his eyes, his whole body rigid, as if bracing for a blow. "Colt," she breathed. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was not a practiced kiss. It was soft, hesitant, clumsy. It tasted of dust and salt and dried blood. It was a question, a comfort, a thank you. All in one. Colt did not respond. He did not kiss her back. He did not pull away. He did not put his arms around her. He just stood there, rigid as the fence post, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes squeezed shut. He was a man taking a punishment. She pulled back, her heart aching. His eyes were still closed. "Good night, Colt," she whispered, her voice breaking. She turned and ran, her feet flying over the dark ground. She reached the cabin, stumbled inside, and shot the bolt on her door. Her lips burning. She woke before dawn, her first thought a wave of shame. The bolt. She had locked him out. She crept from her bed, her feet cold on the floor, and slid the bolt back, her hands shaking. She opened the door to the main room. It was empty. The hearth was cold. A premonition of dread seized her. She ran to the window. The sky was a pale, cold gray. His horse was gone from the corral. His rifle was gone from the pegs on the wall. She ran to the barn. The stall was empty. His bedroll was gone. He was gone. He had run, just as Mr. Agnew had said. He ran from the fire, and now he was running from her, from a single, gentle kiss. Clara sank onto the porch step, the cold wood biting through her nightgown. The feeling was a hollow, familiar sickness. Her father, collapsing by the well. Her mother, vanishing into the dust storm. And now Colt. She had reached for him, truly reached for him, and he had vanished. She felt abandoned, again. One day passed. The silence of the ranch was no longer full. It was empty. Screaming. Eli was pale, his fear palpable. "He is not coming back, is he, Clara?" She did not answer. 2 days. She did the chores by rote. She fed the chickens he had bought. She milked the cow he had traded for. Her movements were wooden, mechanical. 3 days. Dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of purple and blood. She was on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the empty road, her heart a cold stone. She heard it, the slow, tired plod of a single horse, dragging. A dark shape emerged from the twilight. A horse, its head low, exhausted, and a rider, slumped over the saddle horn. The horse stopped at the porch and stood. trembling, lathered in sweat. Colt did not get down. He just stayed there, his head bowed. "Colt?" she whispered, the stone in her chest cracking. She ran to him. He slid, more than dismounted, collapsing into her arms. He was a dead weight, his body radiating a dry, terrible heat. "Rustlers," he groaned, his voice a dry rattle. "Over the ridge. Our cattle. The ones I bought." He was injured. She saw it now. His shirt was soaked, dark and sticky. Not from a bullet. It was a long, tearing gash along his ribs. An ugly knife wound. "Alone?" he mumbled, his head falling against her shoulder. "Had to stop them. Alone." He had not been running from her. He had been riding to protect what was theirs. She and Eli dragging himself across the floor with his powerful arms, pulled him inside. Onto her bed. The bed he had never been in. She cut the shirt away. The wound was deep, jagged, and inflamed. He was burning with fever. She cleaned it with whiskey, her hands shaking, her stomach rolling at the raw, torn flesh. He did not stir. She stitched it closed, her needlework clumsy, her heart in her throat. She nursed him, silently. She bathed his face with a cool cloth. She forced water, then thin broth, between his cracked, dry lips. Eli sat in his chair in the corner, his face pale, watching his sister tend the man he had hated. The first night, the fever took him. He thrashed, his strong arms flailing, striking the air. He was not in the cabin. He was somewhere else, somewhere long ago. "The beam!" he yelled, his voice high and thin, the voice of a boy. "It is on him! Get it off! Get it off!" He grabbed Clara's arm, his grip like a blacksmith's vice, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Wyatt, I am coming! Wyatt, do not scream! I got you! I got you!" And then he broke. He wept. Not the tears of a man, but the deep, dry, tearing sobs of a boy who had seen the end of the world. He was reliving the fire. Clara's heart split open. All the walls, all the silence, all the anger. It was just this, a boy trapped in a burning barn, holding his brother. He quieted, but a violent shiver seized him, his teeth chattering, though his skin was fire. Clara looked at the broken man in her bed, the man who took a punch for her, the man who faced 3 rustlers alone for her, the man who was terrified of her kiss. She did not think about the bargain. She did not think about what was proper. She just acted. She blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the embers in the hearth. She lay down on the bed beside him, careful of his wound. She pulled the heavy quilts over them both. She cradled him. She was small, and he was large, but she pulled his head onto her shoulder, his sweat-soaked hair rough against her cheek. He was burning hot, but he instinctively leaned into her warmth, a long, shuddering sigh passing through him. He murmured, his voice thick with fever and grief. "I am sorry, Wyatt. I am sorry. I am leaving. Sorry." "Shh," she whispered, her own tears slipping, silent, into his hair. She held him tighter. "It is all right. You are not leaving." His body relaxed, just a fraction, against hers. "I am here now," she whispered into the dark, fevered night, her vow a comfort against his skin. "I am not leaving." And she held him as he burned. Colt woke with a gasp, his body stiff and aching. The first thing he saw was not the familiar rafters of the barn, but the cracked plaster ceiling of the cabin bedroom. His bedroom. Clara's bedroom. He was in her bed. The sheets smelled of soap and wood smoke. And her shame, hot and sharp, cut through the dull throb of his ribs. He remembered. The fever, the fire. Wyatt. He had cried out. He had wept like a child. And she had held him. He threw the quilts off, his muscles screaming. The sudden movement sent a wave of dizziness through him. Clara was there, asleep in the chair by the bed, her head resting on her arms. She looked exhausted, her face pale, dark smudges under her eyes. He had shown her. He had let her see the weak, broken thing inside him. "Get up," he growled to himself. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the stitches in his side pulled, a fire-sharp pain, and he grunted, bracing himself on the nightstand. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with sleep and fear. "Colt, you are awake. You should not move. Your fever—" "I am fine," he bit out, his voice a harsh rasp. He hated the weakness in it. He hated the concern in her eyes. It felt like pity. He saw the fire in his mind, heard his father's voice. "You are weak. You let him burn." "You are not fine," she said, standing, reaching for him. "You lost a lot of blood. Lie back down. I will get you broth." He flinched away from her hand as if it were a hot brand. "Do not," he snarled. "Do not touch me." Clara froze, her hand hovering in the air between them. The hurt in her eyes was immediate, a visible blow, but he could not stop. The wall he had built, the one she had breached, had to be rebuilt, thicker, this time. "I am going to the barn," he said, grabbing his torn, blood-stained shirt from the floor. He used the wall to pull himself to his feet. "Colt, you cannot. You will tear the stitches. You will—" "I said I am fine." He did not look at her. He could not. He pushed past her, out of the room, each step a fresh agony in his side. He staggered onto the porch, grabbed his boots, and did not stop until he was in the familiar, safe dark of the barn. He collapsed onto his bedroll in the stall, his body shaking, his sides screaming. He was safe, he was alone, and he was ashamed. For 3 days, he reverted to the man he had been. He was cold, silent, and brutal in his work. He ignored the pain in his ribs, mending the tack he had recovered from the rustlers, his movements jerky and stiff. He refused to sleep in the house. He refused to eat at the table. Clara would leave a plate of food on the barn steps. He would not touch it until she was gone, and ate it cold, his back to the house. On the 4th day, she had had enough. She came out at noon, carrying a plate of stew. He was trying to lift a saddle, and the effort made him grunt, his face pale with pain. "You are a fool," she said, her voice not gentle, but sharp with a cold fury. He ignored her, hefting the saddle onto the rail. "You are going to kill yourself, working like this," she said, slamming the plate down on a barrel. "And for what? So you can pretend the last week did not happen? So you can pretend you are made of stone?" "Leave me be, Clara," he said, his voice low, a warning. "No." She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. She was shaking, but not with fear, with rage. "I will not. I am tired of this. I am tired of you treating me like I am the one who hurt you." "You do not understand." "I understand," she cried, her voice breaking. "I understand that you are in pain. I understand that you are haunted. I heard you. You called for him. You called for Wyatt." His head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a wild, cornered pain. "You had no right." "I had every right," she threw back, jabbing a finger at his chest. "I am your wife. I am the one who held you while you burned with fever. I am the one who stitched you up. You do not get to use me for comfort in the night and then treat me like a stranger in the day. I am not some convenience." She took a ragged breath, the tears she had held back finally spilling, hot and angry. "I know what it is to be a burden. Colt, I have lived with it. My brother, this land, but I am not your burden. And my caring for you is not a debt you have to repay with this coldness." She wiped her face, her hands fisted. "And you are not mine. Your past, your fire. That is not a burden you have to carry alone. You are just a man. Just let me. She could not finish. She turned, her shoulders shaking with sobs, and ran back to the house. Colt stood, frozen. He watched her go, his body aching, his walls shattered. He looked at the stew, steam rising in the cold air. That night, he did not come to the table. Clara's heart sank. She had pushed too hard. She had broken the last thin thread between them. She ate her own meal in silence, Eli watching her, his face troubled. After, she cleaned the plates, her movements mechanical. She was about to bank the fire when a shadow fell in the doorway. He was there. He had not eaten. He just stood, his hat in his hands, his face a map of exhaustion and indecision. "Clara," he said. His voice was rough. She waited. "She is right," he whispered, his gaze on the floor. "The girl, she is not a burden." Clara realized he was not talking about her. He was talking about someone else. "What girl?" she asked, her voice soft. He walked in, not to the table, but to the hearth, staring into the low embers. I did not run just because of Wyatt, or my father." He took a shaky breath. "There was a girl, in Texas, name was Mary. I thought, maybe, I could start over. I did not tell her about the fire, about Wyatt. I kept it locked up. But it ate at me." He looked at Clara, his eyes hollowed out by memory. "She was kind, like you. And one night, I had the nightmare. I yelled. I scared her. She asked me what was wrong. And I could not tell her. I could not let her see the thing that was inside me, the thing that killed my brother. So I told her she was better off. I told her I was no good. I left her. I ran." He turned back to the fire. "I have been running ever since. Every time someone gets close, I run. I ran from you. After the festival, I kissed you, and I ran. I rode after those rustlers, telling myself it was for the cattle. But I was running. I rode into their knives just so I did not have to face." He gestured, helpless, at her, at the cabin, at the life he was accidentally building. Clara moved to stand beside him. She did not touch him. "What happened in the barn? Colt? The real story, not the one Mr. Agnew told?" He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the fire settling. "We were playing," he whispered, his voice so low she had to lean in. "In the loft. Father told us not to. He had a rule about matches, but I was 17. I knew better. Wyatt, he was only 8. He just wanted to be like me. I lit a lantern, just to show him. He knocked it over, into the hay." He closed his eyes, his knuckles white on his hat brim. It went up, not like a fire, like an explosion. The hay was so dry, he screamed. I grabbed him, but I was scared. I ran for the ladder, but the smoke, I could not see. He was screaming. He said I was going the wrong way. The main beam fell." Colt continued, his voice dead. "It hit me, knocked us both down, into the worst of it. When I woke up, my back, I could not find him at first. He was quiet. I found him, under the beam. He was—" Colt stopped, his throat working. "I pulled him out. I carried him down, but it was too late. He was already— my father, he met me on the grass. He looked at what I was carrying, and he said, 'You did it. You were supposed to protect him. You let him burn.'" He took a sharp, ragged breath. "He was right. I was scared. I ran for the ladder. If I had just stayed with him, covered him, maybe, but I ran. I let him burn." The confession hung in the air, terrible and final. Clara felt her own throat tighten. She saw it all. The smoke, the boy's terror, the father's cold, unforgiving judgment. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid as stone. "It was a long time ago, Colt," she said, her voice thick. "You were a boy. You were scared. I was 17, he said, shaking his head. Old enough to be a man. It does not matter, Clara said. She turned to face him, her hands clasping his arm. You are not the only one who ran. You are not the only one with ghosts. He looked at her, confused. My mother, Clara whispered, the old, familiar guilt rising up to choke her. She died in a dust storm. You know that, but I never told you how. She let go of him, walking to the window, staring out into the darkness. The sky was yellow. You could not breathe. The dust was so thick. It was like night. Father was out, trying to find the cattle. Mother told me and Eli to stay inside, to put wet cloths over the windows. But I was 10, and I was scared. I thought my father was lost. I thought he would be thirsty. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass. She told me not to go. She forbade me, but I waited until she was in with Eli. And I took the water bucket, and I ran. I was going to find my father. I was going to save him. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. I did not get 10 yards before I was lost. I could not see the house. I could not see anything. I sat down and screamed. I was so scared. Hours passed. The wind finally died down. And I was not lost. I was right by the wood pile. I had just been turned around. I went inside. She was not there. Eli was asleep, a wet cloth over his face. But Mother was gone. Her voice broke. She went out looking for me. Colt, she went into the storm, calling my name because her stupid, selfish daughter had run off. We found her 3 days later, half buried, a mile north. The dust, it filled her lungs. She had suffocated, all because I would not listen, all because I had to be the hero. She turned from the window. He was watching her, his face stripped of its defenses, his own pain mirrored in his eyes. So do not talk to me about guilt, she whispered, her own tears falling. Do not talk to me about killing the ones you love. I live with it every day. The space between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. He saw his own guilt, his own grief, in her, and she saw hers in him. He took a step, then another. He did not reach for her in passion. He reached for her in recognition. His large, scarred hands came up and cupped her face, his thumbs gently wiping her tears. Clara, he breathed, his voice broken. She leaned into his touch, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. It was a surrender to the grief, a surrender to the shared, broken humanity between them. They were not a bargain. They were not a contract. They were two survivors, scarred by fire and dust. He did not kiss her. He just held her face, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. Then, gently, he lowered his head and rested his forehead against hers. They stood like that, in the middle of the dark cabin, breathing the same air, their shared past a quiet, aching presence. He did not go back to the barn. He blew out the lantern. He took her hand, and she led him to her bed. It was not passion. It was not lust. It was two grieving souls climbing out of a storm. They lay down, not on top of the covers, but under them, side by side. He was careful of his ribs, she of his space. But in the cold dark, she found his hand, and he laced his fingers with hers. And for the first time, they slept. Not as a man and a wife, but as two people who had finally, truly stopped running. The bond, forged in confession and grief, deepened. The silence at the breakfast table was no longer empty. It was comfortable. He would watch her braid her hair, and when she caught his gaze in the mirror, he would give a small, almost smile. She would hand him his coffee, and their fingers would linger for a fraction of a second too long. It was a new language, quiet and tentative. Colt's focus shifted. He saw Eli, still sitting in his chair, his face turned to the wall. One afternoon, Colt went to the woodpile and began to work. He built 2 low, parallel bars, anchoring them deep in the hard-packed earth of the yard. "What is that?" Eli asked, his voice suspicious. "Physical therapy," Colt said. He walked over to Eli's chair. "Your legs are not dead. They are just weak. You told me you can feel it when they ache. That is a start." "I cannot walk." "You cannot walk because you sit in that chair and feel sorry for yourself." Colt's voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "Get up." I cannot." "I will help you." Colt bent and slid his arms under Eli. "You are going to stand." He lifted the boy, whose legs dangled, useless. He carried him to the bars and set him between them, forcing Eli's hands onto the wood. "Hold on. Take the weight on your arms." Eli was shaking, sweat _8ing on his forehead. "It hurts." "I know," Colt said, standing behind him. "Now, try." For weeks, it was a ritual of torture. Eli would fall. He would curse Colt, his voice cracking with rage and humiliation. "I hate you. Leave me alone." Colt would just lift him back up. Again. Clara watched from the porch, her heart in her throat, her hands twisted in her apron. Then, one afternoon, Eli, his face purple with effort, his arms shaking so hard they looked like they would snap, moved his right foot. It was a drag, a scrape in the dust, but it was a move. "Good," Colt said, his voice quiet. Again. Eli sobbed, a raw, frustrated sound, but he did it again. He took a step, painful, agonizing, but a step. Gossip in town, which had died down to a dull murmur, turned sharp again. It was no longer pity for Clara, or fear of Colt. It was jealousy. The McCrae Ranch. Once the Langston ruin was thriving. The new well provided water. The fences were strong. And Clara, when she rode in for supplies, no longer looked haunted. She looked content. Preacher Gideon saw her outside the mercantile, and his face, usually set in pious judgment, was dark with suspicion. "Mrs. McCrae," he said, stepping in front of her. "Or so you continue to call yourself. I must warn you, woman. The good people of this town see your arrangement." "Arrangement, preacher?" Clara asked, her voice dangerously calm. "You are living in open sin with that man," he hissed, his eyes flicking around to see who was watching. "It is an abomination. I thought it was a marriage of convenience, to save the land. But this flaunting, it is unseemly." Clara's fury, which had simmered for months, boiled over. "You are unaware we are married?" she asked, her voice clear and carrying. "You, who stood before God and witnessed our vows. You, who signed the register." "That was a contract," he sputtered. "To protect a deed, not a holy union. You are living as man and wife without—" "You see sin, preacher," Clara cut him off, "because you are a sinful man. You see dirt everywhere you look. I see a man who works harder than any three in your congregation. I see a man who protects his family. I see a man who honors his vows, which is more than I can say for a man who uses his Bible to beat a woman on a public street." She stepped around him, her head high, leaving him sputtering in her wake. She returned to the ranch, shaken but proud, to find a letter nailed to her front door. It was official, from a lawyer in Santa Fe. She read it, her blood turning to ice. A distant cousin, a man named Amos Langston she had never even heard of, was laying claim to the ranch. He cited Josiah's original, massive debts to a bank in Santa Fe, debts he had apparently bought. The claim stated that as Josiah's only direct male heir had died, meaning Eli, whom they all assumed was a permanent invalid, the land defaulted to the next serviceable male relative. They rode to the town hall. It was true. The claim was legal, filed with the territorial court. "But I am his daughter," Clara protested. "And you are married," the clerk said, not unkindly. "Which is your only protection. The land is your husband's. Through you. The claim cannot touch Mr. McCrae's property. All you need is the marriage certificate." "We have it," Clara said, relief washing over her. "Yes," the clerk said, shuffling papers, a worried look on his face. "About that, the certificate was filed, but your witness, Preacher Gideon, has filed a statement of moral concern with the court. He is refusing to confirm the legitimacy of the union. He claims it was a sham, a fraud to avoid debt, and that you are not living in a godly or legal state of matrimony. Without the preacher's testimony, the certificate was just a piece of paper. The judge would rule the marriage a fraud, and Amos Langston would get the land." Colt did not go to the preacher. He went to the bank. He knew who was pulling the strings. Mr. Sloane did not bother to stand. He gestured for Colt to sit. Colt remained standing. "You know Gideon," Colt stated. "The preacher is a moral man," Sloane said, smiling, steepling his fingers. "He is concerned for Clara's soul." "What do you want?" "A simple solution," Sloane said, leaning back. "A man like you, Mr. McCrae, a man with a past. A court hearing will not go well. They will ask questions. They will dig. They will find out who you are, where you came from, what you ran from. I wonder how Mrs. McCrae will feel when she learns the truth." Colt's hand moved, a blur, gripping the handle of his holstered pistol. Sloane's hand, just as fast, rested on the butt of a derringer on his desk. You shoot me, you hang, and Clara, she loses everything anyway. The land, her home. You." Sloane smiled, his eyes damp. "But I have an offer. You dissolve this marriage. You ride out. You disappear. In exchange, I will see to it that Clara is taken care of. I will have this claim from her cousin dropped. I will resolve her debts. If she divorces you and marries a man of standing, a man who can protect her, a man like myself." The silence in the office was thick. Colt's thumb was on the hammer of his pistol. "Think, McCrae," Sloane whispered. "You stay. She loses everything. You go. She is safe. With me." Colt's voice, when he spoke, was a low, terrible growl, the sound of gravel grinding. "A court hearing is scheduled. Be there." He turned and walked out. He told Clara everything. The preacher, Sloane, his past. She did not flinch. "He wants me. He will not have me." She put her hand on his arm. "What will you do? In court? They will ask." He looked down at her hand, then into her eyes. The fear was gone from his. "I will testify," he said. "I will tell them my name. I will tell them about my father and about Wyatt. I will tell them I ran. And then I will tell them that I am done running. This is my land. You are my wife, and I am not leaving." A hearing was set for the next day. The night before, the air was still, cold, and dry. Clara woke to the smell of smoke, acrid, thick. She looked out the window. The sky was not dark. It was a pulsing, terrifying orange. "Colt!" she screamed. "The barn!" It was not just burning. It was an inferno. The hay he had spent all fall cutting, the new tack, the cow. The fire was a roaring monster, devouring their future. "Eli!" she shrieked, running to her brother's room. The flames were already leaping from the barn roof, and sparks, carried on a sudden wind, were landing on the dry shingles of the cabin. Colt burst from the front door, half-dressed. He was not looking at the barn. He was looking at the fire spreading through the dry grass, a burning, racing line, heading straight for the house. "It is too late for the barn," he yelled. "The house! Eli, get him out!" Colt ran back inside, to Eli's room. He did not bother with the chair. He scooped the boy up in his arms, a boy who was no longer a limp weight, but who clung to him, his arms strong. Colt carried him out, through the smoke, and into the middle of the scorched black field they had plowed. Clara grabbed a box of her mother's things and followed, her lungs burning. They stood, the three of them, wrapped in blankets, and watched it all burn. The barn collapsed, a shower of sparks rising to the black sky. The fire licked at the side of the cabin, catching the porch, the dry wood exploding in a whoosh of flame. Sloan, this was his answer. Arson, a warning. If he could not have the land, no one would. As the sun began to rise, the fire died, leaving a field of smoking, black skeletons. The barn was gone. The cabin was a gutted, smoldering shell. Everything they had rebuilt was ash. Eli sat on the ground, his face streaked with soot and tears, his body shaking. Clara sank to her knees. She had nothing left. She had been naive. She had been foolish. She had brought this, all of this, on them. She wept, not in anger, not in fear. She wept for the sheer, crushing hopelessness of it all. They were back to nothing. Colt stood for a long time, watching the last of the embers die. His face was black with soot, his expression unreadable. Then he walked to Clara. He knelt in the ashes in front of her. "Clara," he said. She looked up, her eyes empty. He reached out and took her hands. They were raw, scraped from her frantic attempt to save a water bucket. He held them, his own scarred, strong hands covering hers. "He did not win," he whispered, his voice rough. "He did not burn us. He just burned wood." He lifted her hands, still dirty with soot, to his lips, and kissed her knuckles. He leaned in, across the ruin of their world, and pressed his mouth to hers. It was not a kiss of comfort. It was a kiss of defiance, a kiss of promise, tasting of ash and grief. He pulled back, his eyes holding hers. "I married you for duty," he said, his voice raw. "But that is not why I am staying, not just for duty anymore." The dawn broke cold and gray, revealing a landscape of ruin. The barn was a heap of black, smoking bones. The cabin was a gutted shell, its windows like hollow eye sockets. Eli sat on the plowed earth, wrapped in a blanket, his face a mask of shock. Clara stood, her hands raw, her heart a cold, dead stone. Everything they had fought for, everything Colt had built, was gone. He stood beside her, his face black with soot, his eyes fixed on the smoldering porch. He had not said a word since he kissed her. The silence was broken by the sound of a wagon. Mr. Agnew, their neighbor, pulled his team to a stop. He looked at the barn, then at the house, then at Colt. His leathery face was grim. "Sloan," Agnew said. It was not a question. "Sloan," Colt agreed. Agnew spat into the ashes. "I have been silent too long, letting that man and the preacher run this county. I am ashamed. Mrs. McCrae." He turned to the back of his wagon. It was loaded with fresh-cut lumber. "It is not much, but it is a start." By noon, 2 more wagons had arrived. The Miller family, and the Petersons from the next valley over. They did not say much. They brought tools, sacks of flour, and strong backs. Mrs. Gideon, the preacher's wife, came, her face pale. She did not look Clara in the eye, but she pressed a small tin of coffee into her hands and went straight to Eli, offering him a warm blanket and some broth. It was not charity, it was an apology, it was an army. The town, so long ruled by whispers and fear, had finally seen a line drawn. Sloan had overplayed his hand. He had not just burned out a drifter, he had burned out a neighbor. They did not rebuild the cabin. They started with the barn. It was the heart of the ranch. They worked, all of them, side by side. Colt, his ribs still aching, worked with a silent, focused intensity, directing the men. Clara, her hands bandaged, organized the food and water, her strength a quiet, steady presence that inspired the other women. They saw her. not as the desperate girl who had bought a husband, but as a woman who would not be broken. On the third day, the day of the hearing, the barn had new bones, a skeleton of fresh pine rising from the ashes. Colt and Clara washed their faces at the well, the water cold and clean. They did not have fine clothes. They went to court in patched, soot-stained work clothes. They walked into the town hall not as defendants, but as survivors. The courtroom was packed. Every family they had seen at the festival, every neighbor who had lifted a hammer, was there. Preacher Gideon sat at the front, his face pious. Mr. Sloan was beside him, looking smug. The distant cousin, Amos Langston, looked small and nervous, a puppet on a string. The judge was a territorial circuit judge, a man named Harris with eyes like chipped ice. He listened patiently as Amos's lawyer laid out the claim, citing the debt and the questionable nature of the marriage. Preacher Gideon was called. He spoke of moral duty, of his fear that the union was a sham, a legal trick to defraud creditors. He spoke of Mr. McCrae's violent nature, his reclusive habits. Then Colt was called. He stood, not in the witness box, but in the center of the room. He was calm, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner. "Your Honor," he began, "I will not speak to the law. I am not a lawyer. I will speak to the truth." He looked at Clara. "When I met Miss Langston, she was desperate, and I was lost. I was a man with no future, and she was a woman about to lose her past. She offered me a bargain, her land for my name and my back." He gestured to his soot-stained hands. "I have kept that bargain. I dug a new well. I put up new fences. I brought in a herd. But what started as a bargain, it did not stay one. This land, this is not just a deed to me. It is a home." He looked at the preacher. "You call my marriage a sham. You call me violent. You are right. I did strike Jeb Stewart. He spoke ill of my wife. I will not apologize for that. But you did not see what happened after. You did not see us on a roof in a prairie storm, fighting to save our home. You did not see my wife teach my brother-in-law to walk again. And you were not there 3 nights ago, when this man," he pointed at Sloan, "had our home burned to the ground while we slept." A gasp went through the courtroom. Sloan turned pale. "He did it to stop us from being here today." Colt finished, his voice low and steady. "He burned our home. He burned our food. He burned our child's. He burned our things. But he did not burn us. We are still here. That is not a sham. Your Honor, that is a marriage." He sat. The room was dead silent. "Clara McCrae," the judge said, his voice softer. Clara stood. She was not shaking. Her eyes were clear and firm. "Your Honor, what Colt says is true. I proposed to him out of duty. I was cold. I was afraid. I saw a strong man, and I offered him a contract to save my family. That is the truth." She turned, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, over Gideon, over Sloan. "But that is not the truth that matters. The truth that matters is that duty did not hold us together when the roof tore open. Duty did not stitch up his side when he fought rustlers for our cattle. And duty did not pull my brother from a burning house." She looked at Colt, and the love in her eyes was so plain, so fierce, it silenced every whisper. "I stand by this man. He is my husband, not by law, not by contract, but by fire, and by flood, and by blood. Duty brought us together, Your Honor, but love is what kept us there." The judge looked at the paper in his hands. He looked at Preacher Gideon, his eyes like ice. "Pre-Asser," he said, "your moral concern seems to arise only when it is convenient to Mr. Sloan. You have used this court, and your holy office, to harass this family. It is despicable." He looked at Amos Langston. "As for your claim, sir, it is dismissed. This marriage is as real as the dirt on their hands and the soot on their faces. I rule in favor of Mr. and Mrs. McCrae. This land is theirs." He slammed his gavel. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Mr. Agnew began to clap, slow and deliberate. Others joined. The room filled with a soft, steady applause, a quiet tide of support that washed over the cold malice of the banker. Clara wept, her hand finding Colt's. He squeezed it, his shoulders, for the first time, relaxing. They walked out into the sunlight, victorious. But Sloane was waiting on the steps, his smile gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. "A touching story, McCrae," he hissed. "Truly, but you forgot the ending." A tall man in a dark suit stepped out from the shadows of the alley. He had a star on his vest. "Colt McCrae," he said, his voice flat. Colt froze. The blood drained from his face. He knew that star. "You, Marshal." "You are under arrest," the marshal said. "For what?" Clara cried, grabbing Colt's arm. Sloane smiled. "He seems to have forgotten. Marshal, tell his wife what he really is." The marshal looked uncomfortable. "Colt McCrae, you are wanted in the territory of Texas for the murder of your brother, Wyatt McCrae." The words hit Clara harder than a physical blow. Murder, not an accident, not a tragedy. Murder. Colt just stared, his face shattered. This was the one thing he could not fight. The one lie so old, so dark. It had become truth, his father's words. "Clara," he whispered, his voice broken. I did not." "Put your hands behind your back," the marshal ordered. Colt did not resist. He was a ghost again, the man she had first seen, surrounded by ghosts. As the marshal snapped the cuffs on his wrists, he looked at her, his eyes hollow. "I did not," he whispered again. Then he was gone, led to the town jail. Clara was left on the steps, the townspeople staring, their applause frozen. Sloane walked past her, adjusting his cuffs. "Such a pity," he murmured. "It seems you will be needing a new protector after all." Clara watched him walk away. She did not cry. She did not faint. A cold, hard fury, purer than any she had ever known, settled in her chest. Sloane had not burned her. He had forged her. She did not go to the jail. She went to Eli, who was waiting in the wagon. "Go to the Agnew Ranch," she told him. "You will be safe there." "Clara, where are you going?" "To bring my husband home." She rode straight to the Miller outfit. Agnew had said Colt worked there. She found the foreman. She asked about Silas Croft. "Croft?" the foreman said, scratching his neck. "Yeah, I remember him. Knew Colt back in Texas. Left about 6 months ago. Said he was sick, consumption, headed for the Gila silver camps. He said, chasing a last miracle." Clara did not hesitate. She rode back to the ruined ranch, to the one corner of the barn that still stood. She dug out the small, metal box where Colt kept his money. She took it. She took his rifle from the scabbard on his saddle. She saddled Dust, the one horse that had survived the fire. She rode north, toward the mountains, toward the Gila. The world was rock and wind. She rode for 2 days, pushing the mare, pushing herself. She was not a rider like Colt, and her body screamed. The trail climbed, leaving the plains for the high, cold passes. On the 3rd day, the sky turned a flat, bruised purple. The storm hit. It was not rain, it was snow, a blinding, freezing blizzard that came out of nowhere. She lost the trail. The wind cut through her shawl, through her dress, to the bone. Dust, the mare, whinnied, turning her back to the wind. Clara dismounted, her legs numb, her hands so cold she could not feel the reins. She was going to die, here, in the snow, just like her mother had died in the dust. The same stupid, useless gesture. "No," she whispered, her teeth chattering. She thought of Colt, in a dark cell, waiting for a noose, All because his father had lied. She thought of Sloane, smiling. No. She grabbed the mare's mane. She forced the horse into the meager shelter of a rock overhang. She huddled against the animal's warm, trembling body, her own body shaking violently. She pulled Colt's rifle from its scabbard, holding it, not for protection, but because it was his. She would not freeze. She would not stop. The storm broke at dawn. She was alive, barely. She found the mining town an hour later. It was not a town. It was a scar in the valley, a collection of muddy tents, raw plank saloons, and coughing men. She found Silas Croft in a canvas lean-to at the edge of camp, a place for the dying. He was a skeleton, his skin like yellowed paper, his breath a wet rattle. "Silas Croft?" she said, her voice a cracked whisper. His eyes flickered open. "I am Clara McCrae," she said, kneeling in the mud beside his cot. "Colt's wife. He is in jail, in Colorado. They say he murdered Wyatt." Silas's eyes focused, a spark of old fire in them. "McCrae, Colt," he coughed, a terrible, racking sound that brought up blood. "No," he gasped. "No, Jed, old Jed, his poison." "I know," Clara said, pulling a pencil and the last page of her father's account book from her pocket. "You have to tell me. I have to write it down. Please, Silas. The truth." "The fire," he whispered, his eyes on the tent ceiling, seeing the past. I was there. I was the first one in the house. Jed's hand. I saw the lantern. Knocked over. An accident. The boys." He fought for breath. "I pulled Colt out. His back ruined. He was still holding the little one. Wyatt, he was already gone. Colt, he did not know. He was just holding him, trying to shield him." Silas's voice was failing. "Jed came. He saw them. He did not go to Colt. He hit him while he was down. You killed him," he roared. "You worthless. You killed my boy." He never loved Colt. Hated that he was strong. Hated that he survived. "He lied to the law?" Clara asked, her pencil flying. "Yes," said Colt. "Said it out of spite. A lie. A black lie. It was an accident. Colt, he just ran. He could not fight his own PA." "Sign it," Clara begged, holding the paper and pencil. "Please, Silas, just your name." His hand, a gnarled claw, shook violently. He gripped the pencil. Clara held the paper steady against her knee. He scratched out his name, a jagged line. He looked at her, his eyes suddenly clear. "Good boy, Colt. You are his safety." His hand went slack. His head fell back. He was gone. Clara did not weep. She folded the paper, put it inside her dress, against her skin. She walked out of the tent, mounted the weary mare, and rode south. She returned looking like a dead woman. She was covered in mud. Her lips cracked and blue, her eyes sunk deep in her head. She did not stop at the ranch. She rode dust straight down the center of town, to the marshal's office. Sloane was there, laughing with the marshal, a cigar in his hand. Clara stumbled through the door. The paper was in her hand. She did not speak. She just slapped it on the marshal's desk. The marshal stopped laughing. He read it. His face hardened. He read it again. He looked at the signature, then at Clara. "Silas Croft? He is dead," Clara whispered, her voice raw. "He died in my arms. After he signed it, it is the truth." The marshal looked at Sloane, his eyes full of a new, cold disgust. This is a sworn deathbed statement, Sloane, from an eyewitness. It says the charge was a lie, filed by the boy's father." That is hearsay," Sloane blustered. "It is enough for me." the marshal said. He took his keys and walked to the cell. "McCrae, you are free to go." The cell door swung open. Colt walked out, his eyes blinking, his face gaunt from 3 days in the dark. He saw Clara. He saw the ice in her hair, the mud on her face, the raw, bleeding skin on her hands. He saw the rifle in her grip. He did not go to her. He did not embrace her. A terrible, dark fury rose in his face. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, and dragged her out into the street, away from Sloan, away from the marshal. "What did you do?" he roared, his voice shaking. He was not glad. He was furious. "You rode into the Gila? You, alone, through the storm? You could have died. Clara, for a piece of paper, you stupid, foolish woman." His anger, after everything she had done, everything she had faced, was the last thing she could bear. She broke. She collapsed against him, not in love, but in a storm of weeping, her small, frozen fists beating against his chest. "I could have," she sobbed, her voice a raw, shredded thing. "I could have died, but I did not. What was I supposed to do? Sit here and knit? Let them hang you? You think this is a game?" She grabbed the front of his shirt, shaking him. "You think I married you for safety? You think I fought off bankers and preachers and fire just to let you be taken from me by a lie? I am not safe. Colt, I have never been safe." She looked up at him, her face a ruin of tears and dirt. "I did not marry you for duty. I did not marry you for land. I married you because I saw you in town a year ago, and you looked as broken and as haunted as I felt. I married you because I saw what you were trying to hide, and it was the same damn thing I was hiding. I married you because I was alone, and you were alone, and I could not bear it anymore." She was done. She sagged against him, her confession hanging in the cold air. He stared down at her, his own anger shattered, his face breaking, all the walls, all the fire, all the running. It was over. She had not run from his past. She had ridden into a blizzard to destroy it. She had seen the worst of him, and she had called it home. His hands, no longer angry, came up to cup her face, his touch so gentle it ached. "Clara," he whispered. His voice was thick, broken. He had no words for what he felt. He had never had them. He had only ever had one truth, the one he ran from. And now he ran to it. "I love you, Clara." It was a confession, a surrender. She looked up, her weeping stilled, her eyes searching his. "I love you," he said again, his own tears finally falling, tracing lines through the soot on his face. He buried his face in her cold, tangled hair. "I am so sorry. I love you." He pulled her to him, his arms a steel cage, and she wrapped hers around his waist, holding on as if she would drown. They collapsed into each other, two ragged, scarred, and exhausted souls, finally whole, in the middle of the muddy street. Spring came slowly, as if afraid to commit. It crept up the canyons first, a faint green blush on the willows, before it dared to touch the high plains. The land, scarred and blackened by Sloan's fire, was the last to heal. But the prairie was a stubborn thing. New grass, impossibly green, pushed up through the ash. The wind, which had once carried only dust and grief, now carried the sweet, damp smell of thaw. The ranch was different. The new cabin, built smaller and tighter by the hands of their neighbors, stood 100 yards from the black, rectangular scar of the old one. The new barn was half the size, built of raw, yellow pine that smelled sharp in the sun. The scars remained. Clara's hands, which had healed from her ride to the Gila, were still raw and red from lye soap and hauling lumber. Colt's back, she knew, would never heal, and the black patch where their first home had stood, that would be a shadow on the land for years. But it was a shadow they had survived. Sloan was gone. The U.S. Marshal, disgusted by the banker's malice, had made it his personal business to audit the bank's books. He found years of predatory loans, fraudulent claims, and abuse of power. Sloan was gone before the sun set, his reputation as ruined as the cabin he had burned. Preacher Gideon, shamed by the judge and shunned by his own congregation, still held his pulpit, but his sermons had lost their fire. They were hollow, quiet, and no one met his eyes. Life settled into a new rhythm, with the house rebuilt and the spring planting done. Clara found the old silence returning, but it was a different kind. It was the silence of an empty day, not an empty heart. "They cannot read," she said one evening, mending one of Colt's shirts. Colt looked up from the harness he was oiling. "Who?" "The Peterson children. The Agnew boy. None of them. They are running wild. They need a school." Colt nodded. "So, build one." "With what?" she smiled. "With this," he said, tapping the cabin wall. "We have a roof. We have a floor. What else does a school need?" The next week, she rode to every neighboring ranch within 10 miles. She did not ask for money. She offered to teach, reading, writing, sums, 5 days a week. The first day, 3 children showed up, shy and dirty, clutching a shared, tattered primer. By the end of the month, she had 9. The main room of their cabin, which had seen death, despair, and a desperate bargain, now echoed with the sounds of children reciting their letters, the scrape of chalk on a slate Colt had framed for her. And Eli was her partner. He was walking now. The recovery had been slow, agonizing. He would never ride again. His right leg dragged, and he would always need a cane. One Colt had carved for him from a stout piece of ash. But he was walking. The bitterness that had poisoned him was gone, burned away by the fire and by Colt's relentless, tough encouragement. He had his father's head for numbers and a sharp, biting wit that the children, surprisingly, adored. He sat at the main table, his bad leg propped up, and drilled them on their multiplication, his voice crisp and clear. "No, Thomas," he would snap. 4 times 7 is not 27. You are guessing. Think. McCrae does not build a fence by guessing where the post goes. You do not build a sum by guessing either. Again. Clara would watch him, her heart so full it ached. Her brother, who she had feared would die in that chair, was now a teacher. He had a purpose, a dignity, that shone from him. Colt, too, had found his own quiet rhythm. He was a rancher. The herd he had bought, the one he had nearly died defending, was thriving. He spent his days in the saddle, his work a constant, moving prayer. He was still a quiet man. The horrors of his past, the long years of running, had not made him talkative. But his silence was no longer a wall. It was a space she was welcome in. He had changed in ways she had not expected. One night, she woke to the smell of the lantern burning low. He was not in bed. She found him at the table, the same one where the children learned their sums. He had a pencil, blunt and thick, and one of Eli's old ledgers. He was not doing sums. He was writing. She stood in the shadow of the bedroom doorway, watching, his large, scarred hand, so used to the rope and the axe, moved with a slow, clumsy care over the paper. He would write a line, then frown, his brow furrowed in concentration. He would erase it, his tongue caught between his teeth. He was not writing a letter. He was, she realized, writing a poem. She saw a few of the words, dry, well, water, in, eyes. He was writing about her, about the day she had come to him. He sensed her and looked up, his face flushing dark. He immediately closed the book, his shame as palpable as it had been that morning in the mirror. "Clara," he said, as if caught in a crime. "I was just checking the feed accounts." "Colt," she said, walking to him. She gently laid her hand on the closed book. "It is beautiful. He looked down, his defensiveness melting, leaving him vulnerable. "It is not, it is rocks. The words are just rocks. They do not move right." "Let me read it," she whispered. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he opened the book. She read his poem. It was clumsy. It was simple. The spelling was rough, but it was the truest thing she had ever read. It was about a man dying of thirst, who had forgotten what water tasted like, until he saw it in a woman's eyes. She did not say anything. She just leaned down and kissed the top of his head. He reached up, his hand finding hers, and held it, tight. A few nights later, she was turning down the simple quilt on their bed. The bed was no longer just hers. It was theirs. It was the place they met at the end of the long day. A place of quiet, simple affection, of hands held in the dark. She saw it on the pillow, a single, folded piece of paper from the same ledger. It was not a poem. His script was dark and careful, as if he had written it a dozen times. "You saved me when I did not want to be saved." She sat on the bed, her hand clutching the paper, her vision blurring. This was his truth. This was the confession that mattered more than any "I love you," whispered in the heat of the moment. This was the testament of a man who had been salvaged, a man who had finally, truly, come home. She folded it, small, and tucked it into the bodice of her nightgown, holding it against her heart. Summer came, and the land was fat. The grazing was good. The wildflowers exploded across the high prairie, a riot of blue, yellow, and deep, aching purple. One afternoon, they rode out together to check the northern fence line. It was a comfortable ritual, their horses walking side by side. They stopped on the low ridge where she had first come to him, the place where she had made her desperate, cold proposal. It was not the same place. The dry well was still there, a stone-covered memory, but the land around it was thick with wildflowers. It was beautiful. Colt dismounted and stood, just looking at it. He turned and offered her his hand. She took it, sliding from the saddle. They did not speak. He just held her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. They stood there, in the quiet of the afternoon, the wind brushing the tall grass against their legs. She remembered the girl who had stood here, desperate, willing to sell her name for a shield, and she looked at the man beside her, his scarred hand holding hers, his eyes at peace, watching the land. "It is funny," she said quietly. "I offered you this land, and it was worthless. You made it worth something." He turned to her, his gaze soft. He lifted her hand, the one with the rough, red knuckles, and kissed it. "No, Clara," he said. "You were wrong. It was not a bargain. You were not trading me the land. You were trading me you. I was just too blind to see what I was getting." They stood there, holding hands, until the sun began to drop, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Their quiet, steady life became a curiosity. The shame that had once surrounded their name had been replaced by a quiet, grudging respect from the county. They were the McCraes, the ones who had survived Sloan, the ones who had rebuilt from ash. The Agnews came for Sunday supper, a regular event. Eli was showing the Agnews' young grandson, Timothy, how to carve a bird from a block of soft pine. Colt and Mr. Agnew were on the porch, their voices a low rumble, talking cattle prices. Clara and Mrs. Agnew sat in the rocking chairs, shelling peas, the bucket between them. Mrs. Agnew, a woman who rarely spoke without purpose, paused, a peapod in her hand. "I do not mean to pry. Clara, Lord knows, it is not my place. But I see you. I see him, and I remember." She gestured to the ranch, to the peace that hung over it. After everything, the way people talked, the fire, that business with the marshal. How did you two make it work? Clara looked at her husband on the porch. He was listening to Mr. Agnew. but his body was angled toward her, a subconscious, protective stance. She thought of the cold cabin, the silent meals, the fevered nights, the ride to the Gila. She smiled, a small, weary, and honest smile. "We did not, Mrs. Agnew," she said quietly. "It did not work. It nearly broke us. More times than I can count. I ran from him. He ran from me. We hid. We fought. We despaired." She looked down at the peas in her lap. "But we stayed. He did not leave, and I did not leave. We just stayed. And I suppose staying is how it gets built." Mrs. Agnew nodded, her eyes full of a deep, womanly understanding. "Aye," she said, "staying. That is the part they never write the songs about." That night, the house was quiet. Eli was asleep in his small room, which Colt had built on as a point of pride. The Agnews were long gone. Clara and Colt lay in bed, the quilt pulled up, the night air cool. "That Timothy is a good boy," Colt said into the darkness. "Smart." "He is," Clara agreed, her head resting on his shoulder. "Mrs. Agnew, she is lucky to have a grandchild." Colt was quiet for a moment. He shifted, turning to face her. Do you want that? Children?" Clara's heart seized. It was the one ghost she had not faced with him, the one fear she kept locked away, more secret than her grief for her mother. I do not know if I can." "Colt," she whispered, the confession tearing out of her. After the hunger, after Father died, I was sick for a long time. Things are not right, not like they are for other women. My mother, she had trouble. It took her years to have me, and even longer for Eli. What if I am barren?" The word was a sentence. In this land, for a rancher's wife, it was a profound failure. She waited for him to pull away, to be disappointed. He did not speak. He just moved. His hand, so rough, came up to cup her cheek. He kissed her forehead, a gentle, solid pressure. He kissed her eyelids, which were squeezed shut, fighting tears. He kissed her lips. Then he slowly, gently, pushed the quilt down, baring her stomach to the cool night air. She shivered, her vulnerability total. He bent his head, his lips, warm and soft, pressed against her skin, just below her navel. He stayed there, his breath warming her. When he looked up, his eyes were clear, his face free of all shadows. "You are already everything," he whispered. He pulled the quilt up, tucked it around her, and drew her close. She laid her head on his chest, on the solid, steady beat of his heart, and the last of her ghosts, the last of her duties, dissolved. They slept, and for the first time, they left the windows open. The wind that had once been their enemy, that had carried the dust storm that killed her mother, that had howled through their first desperate winter. It was just a breeze now. It brushed the simple cotton curtains, carrying the smell of sage and pine and clean, new grass. It was the sound of peace. In the final scene, Clara woke slowly. The cabin was filled with the soft, gray light of dawn. The air was cool and sweet. She smelled coffee, already brewing on the hearth. She smiled, stretching, her body warm and safe in the bed. She was alone. The cabin door opened. Colt stood there. He had washed his face at the well, his dark hair damp, his shirt unbuttoned at the neck. His scar, in the soft light, was just a part of him. He was holding a clumsy fistful of wildflowers, their stems dripping, their petals a mix of deep blue and brilliant yellow. He had picked them from the field. He walked to the bed, a small, shy smile on his face. He held them out to her. She sat up, pulling the quilt around her, and took them. She buried her face in the blossoms, their scent earthy and wild. She looked up at him, her eyes full of a quiet, settled joy. "For duty?" she teased, her voice soft. He leaned down. He kissed her, slow and deep, a kiss of a man who is home. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. "For love," he replied, his voice a low, happy rumble. "Always." Thank you for listening to this story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.